Python is a really cool language in that sense that, first of all, it's quite easy to use, and second of all, there's a big community of people that are posting their solutions to different problems online. So if you want to do something, chances are someone else has done it before, and you can take inspiration from what they've done. And then the second part of it, as you mentioned, AI is racing teams gather a lot of data. You have a lot of data from the car itself. You have a lot of data from simulation. If you go testing, you can fit extra sensors to the car. And so you have a lot of data, and then it's quite difficult to figure out what to do with it. University doesn't teach you how to be an engineer, but it teaches you how to think like an engineer.
Cool. Then we can kick things off, Joao. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Really cool. So yesterday I was actually watching the engine braking podcast. So something I accidentally found because on Twitter I announced that you will be on my show, and then people start commenting, and they actually said that you were on this show. So anyone want to delve a little bit more into technical details, they have to check out this podcast because it's really, really good, and you make a ton of jokes. So it's really, really recommendable at that podcast. Really, really nice one. Today we'll talk about a little bit about. Yeah, it's really cool. Sorry. I like the show a lot, and it was over an hour, I think.
Yeah, I was surprised that I don't have TikTok. I haven't got into that latest craze, but I was surprised people telling me that I was trending on TikTok because of a clip of that video where I talk about being escorted out of the office from Red Bull or something. And then from then on, I had like 20 people telling me about that. It was really funny.
Yeah, maybe you can talk about that story in the podcast. Really interesting. So I will talk about your journey a little bit, how you became an F1 race engineer, if that's a correct title. But maybe to kick things off, maybe talk a little bit about yourself, Joe. Who are you? What are you doing currently? And what's your purpose in life?
That last one might take longer than an hour to answer. My name is João Ginete. I'm an engineer. I'm from Portugal. I grew up in Lisbon, moved to the UK to study engineering, aerospace engineering. Then somehow ended up working in F1. I didn't really go into my degree hoping to get into motorsports, but I had the chance to go to the US for a year abroad, and there I did what in the US they call Formula SE, in Europe they call Formula Student, and it's essentially a student project where you design and build the race car as a small team. And I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed that more than the rest of my degree, basically. So when I came back to the UK, I decided that that's what I wanted to do. And I got lucky to get a job at McLaren as an aerodynamicist, so working on kind of the car development from the aerodynamic side. A few years after that, I moved to Red Bull. I did that for a couple of years on the F1 side. Then I ended up working on the Valkyrie as well. And after that, I decided that I wanted to learn a little bit more about the rest of the car and vehicle performance and vehicle dynamics and such. And so I kind of moved into race engineering, and at lower levels, I started in Formula 3, then moved to LMP2 for a bit. And then last season, I was a race engineer in Formula 2. And now I'm figuring out what's happening next year and what I'm doing next. But
yeah, really cool. I think you're a freelance engineer. How did you get into the world of freelancing in the first place? Is it more freedom for you?
Yes, it's first of all, it allowed me to move back to Lisbon for a bit, which was obviously nice because being around my family, I'd been away for over 10 years. So that's being around my family and back home, basically. So it'd be good to do that. It was good to do that for a bit. It's a different kind of working environment completely because you kind of mostly, working from home between the races, but then it's very intense trackside work during the races, in the events. So it's kind of, it's good to switch between the two environments, instead of being in an office 9 to 5 for a whole year. It's a lot more dynamic. It's you come out of the race weekend thinking about things to improve, you sit down and you improve them, and you go back into the next race weekend and you kind of see the effect of that on your performance and on how easy it is to do your job. But how did I get into it? I wanted to get into race engineering. I didn't specifically think that freelancing, was the way to go. But I quickly realized that that's how it works for the most part. I mean, you do get full-time jobs in at lower levels, but I'd say at least 50%, if not more, of the people who are employed as engineers in low level work as freelancers. And so, but yeah, it started as, so I asked, while I was still at Red Bull, I asked to get more involved in race engineering. I started working with the junior drivers still at Red Bull. And then just out of nowhere, so I was working with Adrian on the Valkyrie, and Adrian's son, Harry, was driving for an LMP2 team in the European Le Mans Series. And that team fired their engineer, and they needed someone to engineer the car. So Adrian came and asked, "Do you want to go engineer your car this weekend?" And 3 days later, I was in Austria and I was engineering a car, which was a bit of a shock because I'd never done it. Obviously, I had help from him who has done it a lot, and that was invaluable. But I think it was a big eye opener for, like, how much I needed to learn, especially on the practical side, how much I need to learn in terms of how a race goes, how communicating with mechanics, drivers, team principals, all that. So that was a bit of a shock. Also coming from Formula One, where money is not a problem, going to a place where the resources were very limited. That was also a big shock, but I'm glad I did it. And so basically from that point onwards, the following season I got a job still at Red Bull, but I got a job in Japanese Formula 3. So I was going back and forth between Europe and Japan all the time, which was quite tiring. But again, completely different world, as you can probably expect. And then at the end of that season, I realized I could probably just do that for a living. I thought that for someone with very little experience, I did an okay job, and I'd only get better as I did more. And so I decided at the beginning of 2020 to give that a go. Obviously, then the pandemic hit, which made the timing not ideal, but I managed to survive with a couple of jobs that year, and then I kind of went from there.
Super interesting. A lot of people also ask me on Instagram when I announced the podcast is, how does a day of Joao look like? And by the way, Joao is the way you pronounce your name, right? There was someone, I'm not sure if you worked with him before, he's called Mark Lane, ex-McLaren.
Yeah.
I think he called you Cowboy. Was Cowboy your nickname? I didn't get that joke.
No, we were all, I think basically a cowboy is, so Mark is a surfacer. So he's one of the guys who takes our ideas and puts it into an actual shape. So sometimes, most of the time we do that ourselves. Not most of the time, but a lot of the time we, like aerodynamicists, do that ourselves when the job is simple enough. But when things get really complicated, like big bits of bodywork, kind of brake ducts, which was Mark's specialty, at least at the time. And then we need guys that help us with that. For instance, at Red Bull, the surfaces also take Adrian's drawings and turn them into CAD surfaces, because Adrian likes to draw it on his drawing board. And so Cowboys is what you call someone who doesn't necessarily use the best practices in terms of surfacing. Because there's a way of doing things properly and there's a way of doing things quickly. And so we kind of joke that the guys who did things quickly and didn't care that the model fell apart as soon as changed something by a millimeter were cowboys. And so that was kind of, that's where that comes from. That was my nickname. I've had many nicknames because my name is difficult to pronounce for non-Portuguese speakers, but that was not one of them. It was more of a general.
Yeah, Cowboy was one of them. Then Joao, basically J dash and then Wow was also one of them. Really cool. So how does a
Joao? I acquired that one in the States because Jersey Shore was quite popular at the time. Okay. And there's a character in Jersey Shore called Joao, and so my team leader at the time started calling me Joao, and I didn't know who the character was. Turns out it was a girl, a girl with some enhanced features, surgically enhanced features, let's say. And I had no idea until 6 months later, and then it was too late. Everyone called me Joao, so it kind of stuck.
So we won't stick to it in the podcast. I hope I pronounced it correctly, though. Joao. Okay, cool.
It's good enough.
So, okay, fair enough. Cool. So how does a day of you look like? When do you wake up? What do you actually work on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I'm not a morning person. I'm a bit of a night owl. So normally I get up around 8, 8:30. I like to have I need to have a slow morning because my brain doesn't start working until I've had my coffee. So I take care of that first. And then normally I work. It kind of depends. If I'm between events, if I'm not trackside, then I will work on what I have to do. It can be depends on the projects I'm involved in, but it can be anything from kind of running simulations to prepare the next race, improving the tools that we use. If I'm doing an aero design project, doing something in CAD for that, looking at some results, writing reports as well for previous events and future events. Occasionally have meetings, so I can be busy with that in just like Zoom, Teams sort of environment. If I do stay at home some of the time, but if I feel like I have a need to be concentrated for extended periods of time, I actually prefer to go somewhere else because I don't get distracted by things as easily. So there's a couple of like coffee houses around me that in Lisbon, and I usually just get on my bike and go there. And I sit there for the day doing that. And then normally I like swimming and running and cycling and occasionally doing triathlon. So I do one of those three, either at lunchtime or in the afternoon. And then normally I do a bit more work in the evening, just because I like going to bed too early. So occasionally my colleagues get very surprised when they log in the morning and have an email from me at 2 a.m. That happens quite often.
Interesting.
But yeah, obviously when I'm trackside, it's very different from that. It depends on the schedule, but often you arrive at you wake up at 5:30, you're at the track at 6 because you have your first session at 9 and you have to prepare everything, and then sometimes you have sessions until quite late and you're actually back home until like 11, and it can get quite full on.
Mm-hmm. I think people would be also interested in what is the work-life balance, quote unquote, like of your job?
I'd say it's actually not too bad. I'd say it depends on how many jobs you're doing, and because it's quite common for people to do multiple championships, and then it can become tricky because it's quite difficult to keep on top of everything else. For instance, in 2020, I did 2 championships, and there were periods where I had 7 races in 8 weeks, and then you're just jumping around from place to place, especially COVID year, where it's doing a COVID test every 2 days and getting on, not a lot of airplanes. Everything was kind of quite disrupted. So that was a tricky summer. But I think living in Lisbon gives me the benefit of, what I was saying earlier of, I work until 5. I still have a few hours that I can go to the beach and hang out with my friends for a bit, and then do a bit more work in the evening. So I think it's quite decent because you set your own schedule. You obviously have work to do, and in terms of working weekends, that's never been a problem for me. I don't mind doing a handful of hours over Saturday and Sunday, or a bit more if needed. I'd rather do that than to be at home or in an office 12 hours a day for 5 days and then do nothing at the weekend. I'd much rather spread it out. And it's good to have the flexibility to do that. Obviously, I've worked in places where that flexibility wasn't there, and you adapt, and it's fine. It's not the end of the world. But I quite enjoy the fact that I can set my own schedule and spread things the way that works for me, and get in a social life in the meantime.
Definitely. We'll talk about the work environment, especially McLaren versus Red Bull, in a second. You talked about CAD and CFD and all the other bits that you've worked on in the past or right now. What tools are you actually using on a day-to-day basis? Is also an AI tool involved? Because people were asking that on Twitter, actually. Are you using any AI tools in F1? or F3?
So last year in F2, in fact, over the past couple of years in first in LMP2 and then in F2, a big part of my job was to set up and kind of develop processes to use, first of all, lap time simulation, which is not, it's becoming commonplace at the lower levels of racing, but there's a lot of potential to use it better than it's generally being used. In F1, it's at quite a high level. That's kind of a different world. But in the lower levels, it's not as widespread as it should be, and it's not used as let's say to its full potential or anywhere near its full potential. So that was kind of my job in my last two teams, was to set that up and figure out how to best use it. And it was a big learning curve, and it was developing continuously. And if today I were to do it again, I'd do it differently again. And it's a continuous process for me to learn as well. And then the second part of it, as you mentioned, AI is racing teams gather a lot of data. You have a lot of data from the car itself. You have a lot of data from simulation. If you go testing, you can fit extra sensors to the car. And so you have a lot of data, and then it's quite difficult to figure out what to do with it. And that's where AI tools can be quite helpful in kind of helping us with data reduction, and then kind of using that data to create models that help us predict things that we don't know. So as we work together with Monolith, which is the sponsor of Jota at the moment, which was a team that I used to work for, and that was the first time that I kind of used something like this, and it was again a big learning curve to try and understand what it can do or it can't do, because there's a lot of people who think AI is this magical thing and just throw stuff in and then it gives you amazing things, and it's nothing like that. It's just a tool like any other. You need to know how you need to treat things to give it, what it needs. This is like, one of the three main rules of data analysis, and the most important one is, I don't know if I can swear, but shit in, shit out. Like it's as simple as that. If you give it a tool data in the format, or with corrupt lines, or with data that shouldn't be there, that's just confusing it, then it's going to give you a bad result. But also, understand what it can do well, what it can't do well, and use it properly to give you an advantage, rather than to just confuse you and throw you off in weird directions. And yeah, it's obviously I use Monolith quite a lot at Jota, and then had to figure out how to live without it, which was difficult. But Python is a really cool language in that sense that, first of all, it's quite easy to use, and second of all, there's a big community of people that are posting their solutions to different problems online. So if you want to do something, chances are someone else has done it before, and you can take inspiration from what they've done and do your own version of it quite easily without being a great programmer. Like, I'm definitely not a software developer, but I think everything I've wanted to do, I've managed to find a way to do it in Python, by taking inspiration from people who are better programmers than me and have shared it with us kindly.
Yeah, exactly. Exciting. I will also put the links, maybe if people are interested from the F1 space. I think we did 2 webinars. One was AeroMap modeling, and the other one was on tire degradation modeling. So Pacheco model versus AI model. I think that would be super interesting for a lot of people here. And one of the reasons I ask what models what tools you've used before is because I think people have this kind of the conception of, or like the concept in their mind that I need to learn that tool, therefore I'm going to be a good CFD or like an aerodynamicist. How do you see that personally? Is it the tool really, or is it the engineer himself, how he uses the tool to his advantage or to their advantages?
I mean, the tools, like, I mean, obviously from the aerodynamics point of view, there's also CAD and TFT that I haven't talked about. I was mostly talking about from the race engineering, from my most recent experience. But yeah, CAD obviously is what you use to draw, and there's different. There's 2 main ones that different F1 teams use. Some use CATIA, some use NX. They have different strengths. But on the to kind of give you insight of aerodynamics, there's kind of three main kind of set of tools, like CFD, where it's kind of a computer simulation of your geometry in kind of the environment that you set it up in, which is powerful, but because the Navier-Stokes equation cannot be solved analytically, then you have to kind of simplify them quite a bit, and that comes with its own problems, especially in problems where there's a lot of turbulent flows, like an F1 car or any sort of ground vehicle. Airplanes are a lot tidier and so a lot easier to simulate in that environment. But there's things that you can't do in wind tunnels that you can only do in CFD. For instance, modeling the fact that when the car is going around the corner, the airflow around it is curved. You can't do that in a wind tunnel, at least not one that I know of. But you can do that easily in CFD. The wind tunnel, on the other hand, is a model scale kind of experiment of a full size car. It comes with its own problems, but at least it's a physical kind of, it's something that's actually happening. And so you're not simplifying kind of the laws of physics like you are in CFD, but it comes with its own problems. Obviously, the fact that you can't model curvature being one of them, but also the fact that the geometry is going to be slightly different from the real car. You're going to have split lines in different places. Things are going to deflect differently from the real car. Walls are going to be in the way. The tire is not going to be the right shape because, in the real car, the tires are going to deflect in a different way than they do in the wind tunnel because the car is going to be loaded laterally, not just vertically. So there's limitations in both of them. And then you've got trackside kind of tools to measure the car performance. Mostly you've got push rod loads that just measure how much force is going through the push rods. And then from that, you can kind of get an idea of how much vertical force there is on the car from downforce, but they come with their own problems. They're not very accurate. They drift. There's a lot of noise coming from the road. So obviously the cornering forces that you have to subtract because the push rod is not just taking vertical loads, but also lateral loads and a bit of longitudinal loads. And then you have pressure taps, which are great because they just tell you what's happening in terms of like the suction being created by the car, but then turning that into exactly how much downforce are we gaining or losing is quite complicated. It's possible, it's quite complicated. But sorry, answering your question, the tools can be improved, and it's important to not just settle for what you have and kind of always push further to try and get better ones. But it's very important that the user of the tools understands them, not only knows how to use them, but knows their limitation. I think both things are equally important. If you just know how to use something and you think it doesn't have any limitations, you're going to get burned. So it's crucial to know kind of what does this tool do well, what does it not do well, what's my confidence level when doing certain tasks with it, and then adjusting your recommendations and the way you approach the problem that you're trying to solve accordingly. It's very often that simulation tells us to go in a certain direction. We hit the track and the driver doesn't like it and wants to go in a different direction. And then it's quite tricky to then say, okay, no, this is the best car that we can give you. You need to figure out how to drive it versus, okay, let's go away from our optimum and towards what you want and to help you. The answer that like the optimum was probably somewhere in between, because you're dealing with a human at the end of the day. But exactly how far you go from one side of the spectrum to the other, it's a very tricky balance to hit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, compared to F1, F2, and F3, F1, you have, as you said, already way more resources in terms of like tools and whatnot. Do you think, from your perspective, it makes more sense to start maybe higher in a higher rank, so to speak, like F1, and then go to F3? Because I think you would say, maybe you can say that F3 is more going by gut feeling, because you have less tools and less resources available, so you have to go by gut feeling rather than having the tools available at your fingertips. What would you actually recommend people? Start high and then, if you want, go to a lower rank, or how would you?
I can tell you what I did, and I would do the same again. So I guess that's what I would recommend. I started in F1. I learned a lot from very clever people. I learned not only how to do things, but also kind of the way of thinking like an engineer, like a high level engineer. The There's also a lot of people who start from the bottom, start from the kind of F4 and then progress through F3, F2, F1, which is also a valid path for sure. But the difference here is that as you say, that race engineering and trackside engineering in general is a hybrid of engineering processes and gut feeling, and experience and intuition, and all that comes from doing the job for a few years. The thing is, if you start by doing the gut feeling only, which is how the lower levels of motorsport tend to be, there's not a lot of actual engineering. There's more kind of learning from experience and kind of building on that. You can kind of forget the fact that you're an engineer, and obviously then if you get reminded, if you get to a certain level while engineering tools are used, then it could be that it all sorts itself out. But you don't want to be stuck in the way of kind of just going with intuition and experience and ignore the engineering tools and engineering knowledge that you have and that you've learned, because that is going to become very inefficient, because you'll just be following your previous experience, that maybe with different cars, with different drivers and different tracks, and it can all get very confusing. There's a reason why engineering tools were developed. There's a reason why Formula One teams ended up developing all these lap time simulations and all that. Whereas if you come from a more kind of an engineering standpoint, and then you add the intuition experience to it to kind of correct your path if you're going down the wrong path. For me, that makes more sense, and it effectively keeps you tied to something that is not sure, but something that is physical. It's not subjective, it's objective. It happens very often in all the trackside activities. It can happen that you make the wrong decision but end up winning the race, or that you make the right decision and you end up losing the race. But that doesn't mean that if you my point is, if you're going to learn by the outcomes of your decisions purely, and don't try to use our engineering tools to figure out why this happened, then you can be led the wrong way, because the outcomes in terms of performance are affected by so many things. Conditions, the way the driver was feeling on that day, technical problems. There's so many things that can affect the outcome of your decisions that are not necessarily something you should learn from. So if you come from an engineering standpoint, then you can kind of normalize all these things out of the way and just focus on your job, what you did, and what impact it had. And it could be that sometimes you don't know what the answer is. For instance, in race strategy, it's the most common thing is you get to the end of the race, in 9 times out of 10, you don't know if you made the right decision or not. You don't actually know. In fact, I used to say that in strategy, you always know when you made the wrong decision, but it's very rare that you know when you made the right one, because it's pretty obvious. You decide on something and then it blows up in your face. Yeah, we messed up there. But when things go well, or when things don't go well, but you feel like you made the best decision you could, you always kept wondering, like, could I have done it a bit differently? And the same is true for kind of decisions on setup direction, kind of run plan, and all that. All the jobs of a race engineer, there's always a doubt in your mind of whether you made the right call. But I feel like coming from F1 and from a very kind of detached from racing, because that's the reality. At least when I was there in our department, is that I felt quite detached from the racing itself. I felt like I was working on an engineering problem: how to make this car faster, how to make more downforce and improve the characteristics, etc. And that makes you think, like an engineer, rather than like a racing person. There is value to it, there's a lot of value to it, and that's the thing in racing. You end up having to combine both. But I think it's dangerous if you only focus on the kind of the intuition, experience, and what's the word, empirical approach.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Joao. I was wondering, actually, the further you progress in your career, you personally, for example, although you have the tools, do you feel that the tools are kind of a synergy with the engineer? Because as you progress in your career and you have so much more to learn, but the more you learn, the more you actually know what you don't know. And therefore the tools enable you to basically solidify the knowledge or like your intuition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's I think what you said is what I say very often. It's the more you grow as an engineer, the more you realize what you don't know.
Yeah.
So like you know more, but the main aspect of it is understanding what you don't know. And yes, the kind of your relationship with your tools is exactly that, is to kind of narrow that gap between where you are and what you want to achieve, and get you a little bit closer to what you think is the optimal way of progressing. Then the tools are never going to tell you the full answer, and believing that they do is going to get you in trouble. Yeah. But they will narrow that gap between what you want to know and what you actually know.
Yeah. How is the budget actually limiting the abilities of teams to do, for example, wind tunnel testing and simulation? How does it actually differ in terms of numbers or maybe regulations? What's your experience?
I think the latest round has probably hurt the big teams quite a bit. I think the smaller teams, they're probably pretty much carrying on as they were before, but the bigger teams are having to be very careful about how they use their resources, their wind tunnel time, the CFD time. But to be fair, at least from when I was in F1, there was still so from the early 2000s, there was the way that aerodynamic development happened was, for me, completely wrong, which was, teams would have 3 wind tunnels operating 24 hours a day for 7 days a week, and they'd just be churning bits through it, just run, kind of run 100 bits, and hopefully one of them will bring you a small gain. And if you do this for the whole season and you find, half a point or a point, you get to do the season and you found a lot of performance, and I guess that's valid. But as an aerodynamicist, for me, it's a lot more fun to understand what the problems are, come up with creative ways to fix them, and then kind of develop those ways until they give you the performance that you want. So taking a less carpet bombing approach and more of a kind of targeted approach to a specific problem that you've spotted is kind of the direction that these new regulations are forcing you to go. But there's still quite a lot of people, especially at higher levels, because at the most senior levels in teams, because they come from that era. They come from the era of carpet bombing. And there's still a lot of people in Formula One teams that operate that way, and it's getting more and more difficult for them, because it's, you just don't have the budget to do it, and not the budget in terms of financial, but in terms of the aerodynamic restrictions. So for me, I think it's actually making the whole aerodynamic development process more of what it should be. But maybe that's because that's the way I like it. But I think an aerodynamicist is someone that tries to understand the problem, come up with ways of addressing it, of improving it, and then implementing that, rather than someone who just, takes a small bit of bodywork and moves it around by 5 mil and does 50 combinations and sends everything and sees what happens, sees what works.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was wondering about the topic of specialist versus generalist. It seems to me that you're more of the T-shaped personality, which means you know a lot of topics very well, and you're at heart still an aerodynamicist, but you're not really specialized in one thing, if that makes sense. So generalist versus a specialist, what's your personal preference, and what do you recommend people to do in general?
I'd say that I was very specialized in aerodynamics until 2018, and then I made a conscious shift to move to an area that made me have to learn about most, if not all, aspects of race car performance to a lesser depth. to a lower depth. I think, the best example for me in that sense is a guy like Adrian Newey, who grew up in an era where you could be doing things like designing your cars at the week and then running your cars at the weekend, and that made him both, specialized in an area like aerodynamics, which happened to be the key performance differentiator for race car performance eventually. So he was ahead of his time in that he spotted the aerodynamics. There was a lot of potential in aerodynamics, and that should be his main focus. But also learn about everything else, because everything is interacting with everything else in race car performance. So understanding just how much compromise you need to make in other areas of the car for the aerodynamic performance, to understand that balance, you have to understand a little bit about the other areas and what in terms of not only in terms of theoretical performance, but also in terms of the practicalities of making those sacrifices. Obviously, nowadays, I think Formula One cars are so complex that maybe whereas in the 80s and 90s, you could, know this much about aerodynamics and this much about everything else, you can probably now know this much about aerodynamics and this much about everything else, because everything just got so much more complicated. But still, having a little bit of knowledge about everything makes you, I think, a much bigger asset for your team than not. It can also rile people up because, if you're trying to talk to someone else, knowing that little bit about their area when they know a lot, they can start feeling like, deauthorized and that you should be sticking to aerodynamics. But I think that's dangerous, because it kind of compartmentalizes people and makes people fight for their own corner, when that's not always what's best for race car performance. It would be better that everyone knew a little bit about everything else, but that's not how kind of Formula teams are built. It's very difficult once you are, for instance, an aerodynamicist. It's very difficult to learn about other parts of the car. I tried. I did my best, but I never got very far. It's not encouraged. It's not something that the team values. It's not. I think in 4 years at McLaren, the only token gesture there was a meeting with the head of powertrain about the new powertrains that were introduced in 2015, the hybrid that currently are in the car. So 2014. We had a meeting towards the beginning of 2014 to explain how it worked and then all the rest of it. But in 4 years, that's the only time that I ever heard about other systems of the car other than Aero. So, yeah, it's a shame that F1 is becoming so overly specialized, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to leave.
Yeah, I see. Wasn't there a story where you suggested, was it called a timetable, and then you got your finger slapped from someone? And then there was a story, wasn't there? Because you wanted to suggest to have a more streamlined process or work more streamlined, to introduce something like a timetable. I'm not sure if that was the case. And then the guy was so offended that he wanted to let you go, but then the wife actually wanted to have you back.
No,
like
this was in LMP2. Now, this was a team that was a bit of a mess, and I after the second race, we did reasonably okay. Finished like 7th out of a 20-something field.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, at the end, I just said, look, I think we have something good here. That there's good people in this team, and we have a good 3 drivers who are pretty competitive, but we need a little bit more structure. Just a timetable would be nice. Just know when the drivers should be here for driver change practice, when we're doing pit stop practice, and all that. And it wasn't received very well, because that's what I was talking about, the kind of lower levels of racing. Everything still runs a little bit like it did 20 years ago, and when they try to kind of bring a little bit more structure, there can be a lot of resistance. But that particular person was very special, so I think that's probably also part of it.
I see. Yeah. Maybe let's go back in time. What did you actually focus on in your studies? Was it aerodynamics, which got you eventually into McLaren, or was it just by luck, so to speak, that you get into McLaren, then worked for them for a couple of
No,
years?
no, no. So in Formula C, I did aerodynamics. I developed the front and rear wing of our car very
Mm-hmm.
badly, obviously, because I had no idea what I was doing. Um, then, I mean, and to be fair, at the time, most judges thought that wings didn't work in Formula student cars, which is obviously not true because now everyone has them, and the people who have the best aero packages dominate. But at the time, it was difficult enough to convince them that there should be wings on the car. And then I did my final year project based on that car, and kind of still in coordination with the guys in America, but back in Bristol in the UK. I did my final year project on kind of comparing wind tunnel and CFD measurements of the same, or wind tunnel measurements and CFD simulations of the same geometry, and how the different turbulence models, different kind of mesh sizes impacted the correlation between the two. And I think that kind of helped me get the job because it's something that's very, important in F1 doing this kind of work. But the reality is, the job at McLaren, I got it because they were desperate, and they actually. It's one of the things I always say. I applied for a senior aero job, knowing that I was nowhere near qualified to be a senior aero. But they're looking for seniors, they couldn't find any. Then they started looking for aeros with 3 years experience, they couldn't find any. And then they started looking for students. And out of the 8 students that they called, I did best in the interview. So it's
Cool.
Yeah. But it definitely, I think my focus on aerodynamics in our university definitely played a part.
Mm-hmm. How was it in terms of the work environment, McLaren compared to Red Bull? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, at McLaren, I got there when Martin Whitmarsh was in charge. Ron Dennis was still the group CEO, I think, or something. But eventually, Martin got pushed out of the way because the car was terrible in 2013. Ron came back, made this big speech on top of the tables in the canteen. It was a pretty epic moment. But Ron's kind of influence in the team was still very strong. And so jeans were banned. You're not allowed to come in jeans to the office. Anything colorful was extremely discouraged. Facial hair was discouraged. At one point, I think it was forbidden, but at this point, it was just discouraged. Things like you couldn't have coffee at your table. You had to have it. It was a clean desk policy. You're not allowed to have anything on your desk because when they showed people around, they wanted everything to look as sterile as possible. The team color was gray. Like the whole building was gray, and the more gray you could keep it, the better. And then moved to Red Bull, where it was completely opposite. Like people would show up in shorts and flip flops if necessary, and no one really cared about what you wore or what you looked like, as long as you did your job. So that was a lot more my style for sure.
Pretty cool. In terms of also the ingenuity, I would call it, in terms of hiring, was there a difference between McLaren and Red Bull? I think McLaren, you said it in the other podcast, that basically they focused on 3 unis, and then Red Bull was more open, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, in vehicle dynamics department at McLaren was pretty much Oxbridge. You either came from Oxford or from Cambridge, and there was very few exceptions to that rule. In Aero, there was a bit more. The most typical one, the most common ones were Imperial and Southampton, because Adrian came from Southampton, and Prod, who was the head of Aero when Adrian was there, came from Imperial. So those networks were quite strong. But you had a few others. You had a few guys from Bristol, like 3 guys that I can remember. And then you have people that came from other teams that would come from different universities. But at Red Bull, it was, there were people that didn't even have degrees working as aerodynamicists, which I think is probably a bit too far. Not, and I'll explain why. It's not a snobby thing. I don't think you need a degree to do a good job at anything. But actually, Adrian, at one point, agreed with me on this point, is that university doesn't teach you how to be an engineer, but it teaches you how to think like an engineer. And so when you miss that bit, you can be an engineer, but you're going to struggle to be a good one because you're not thinking the right way. You're not thinking like your approach to problem solving is not necessarily what it should be. But at the same time, people with a more practical approach and understanding of the different parts of a car, for instance, are very important in some aspect of it. So, for instance, I never worked with him, but a guy called Pat Fry, he was in McLaren, he was at Ferrari, he was in many places. I've always heard of him as being a guy who's quite strong at like the common sense. You know, you have the old people thinking at a very high level of how to make this and that and the other, but then he kind of brings it down and says, okay, how does this all fit together, and how do we make a race car out of this? And so people with the less academic approach are definitely important in a racing team. But if you're going to work, you know, as an aerodynamicist in pure development, I think it helps to think like an engineer, and you can struggle sometimes when you don't.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When we talk about vehicle dynamics, Joe, some people were interested on how do you actually set up the car for different weather conditions, track conditions, and also they wanted you to explain the problem, quote unquote, of porposing. So how does that work, and what was the actually problem of the car bouncing at certain speeds? And we could explain
So
that.
the porposing concept is 40 years old. It's not new. It was there on the first generation of ground effect cars, and it's there now. It's basically, it comes from the fact that obviously the car's making downforce. As it's making downforce, it gets sucked down into the ground. However, it gets to a certain stage where you get so close to the ground, it can be the diffuser, it can be the front wing, but something goes into stall, which is where it's putting so much load it can't recover to the free stream pressure, which leads to separation, like large scale separation in at least parts of the diffuser, and then it loses load. And this is the problem: is that in race cars, everything works as long as you gain load as you go lower. As soon as you lose it, it like sets off this kind of cyclical process where you lose load, the car comes up because it's producing less downforce. Then the diffuser recovers, so you make more downforce, so the car comes down. So the car, and then the diffuser stalls again, and then the car comes up again, and then it recovers, and it comes down, and then this kind of goes on. And it can be obviously a pretty big problem. It's something that we had, for instance, in the LMP2 car a lot. The front splitter would stall quite easily. So if you ran too low under braking, especially if there were bumps to kind of even bring more oscillations to the party, then we'd struggle a lot with that. And the reason it's coming back into F1 now, I mean, it's like it's disappeared completely. You had issues I remember when we had issues in rear wings with rear wing stall. We had issues with front wing stall sometimes. But when you have such a big floor producing such a massive part of your car's downforce, and that floor gives up, then the porposing problem is magnified. As you saw a lot of times this year, and I think it comes from a philosophy which I think everyone kind of suffers from it to a certain extent, but I think Mercedes suffered from it more than other teams because of the philosophy, which was to find as much peak downforce as possible and then run the car as stiff as possible, which is great, but you still can't you can't avoid the fact that there'll be a bump in the track that's going to bring the ride height down, and then if your diffuser blows up when that happens, then you set off a porposing sequence that you can't recover from that easily. I'm not surprised that Red Bull were the ones that suffered the least from it, because they've always focused a lot on characteristics, on keeping the whatever load they generate as constant as possible around the different ride heights. Stay roll the whole aero map to keep it as consistent as possible. Whereas Mercedes didn't really put as much emphasis in that, and it worked out for them in the previous generation of cars, obviously, and they were very successful with that. But with the generation, I think, you can't be too greedy. You can't look for those extra 2 or 3 points at the peak at the expense of what happens away from the peak, because then, you can get bitten by these porpoising gremlins.
I was wondering, why does it happen in the first place? Is it just a wrong setup? Because I'm not an expert in this. Or does it happen because something went wrong? Because we talked about all these tools and empiricism and gut feeling. Why did it happen in the first place? Just a wrong setup?
I mean, I think a big part of the problem was, it came already from air development, was that in the wind tunnel, these issues of the diffuser giving up weren't evident. And I think there's two aspects of this. First of all, there's normal for these things to not match perfectly between track and tunnel because of the limitations of modeling that I've discussed earlier. But also, one big key item here was that you've got these big tunnels under the floor making a lot of downforce, and that's obviously causing deflection to the floor. And that floor deflection was bringing the edges of the floor very close to the ground, which was improving the ceiling, which would give you more load, but also giving it so much load that at very low ride heights, it would blow up. Because that's something that happens that in ground effect, if you put a wing in ground effect, looking at it very simplistically, if you put it in ground effect, it makes more and more load until you get to a point where the air can't flow underneath the wing, and then it stops making load. It's kind of that same principle, but it's not. It's very rare that it gets to the point where you actually choke. It normally happens before, because you're just asking for a very big suction peak, and then you still have to recover to the same free stream pressure, and then your pressure gradient just becomes too adverse, and then you separate. So it's the same thing here. I mean, we had similar issues with back in the days of exhaust blown downforce. Sometimes you'd use your exhaust to increase your diffuser load, but sometimes you increase it so much that the inside of the floor would separate, and then you have diffuser stall. So this is not exactly new, but the magnitude of the problem and what the effect it has visibly and also in terms of the driver feeling is something that we hadn't seen in a while. So it comes from air development and kind of the miscorrelation between track and tunnel, a bit of air elasticity thrown in, and then a bad setup. I won't say it's a bad setup. It's just you're setting your car up with its hands tied behind your back, because you know that there's performance in going lower, but you know that if you go low, the car is going to start bouncing up and down. Because in the corners, you're not bouncing up and down. It's mostly on the straights and through the braking zones. The question is, how much can you sacrifice cornering performance to fix the porpoising problem, and how much your driver can handle porpoising to keep some performance in the corners. So that's it's very rare that you just get the setup wrong. It's more often that you're trying to push the performance side, but you have a limitation that, in terms of ride and comfort, that is kind of holding you back, and hitting that sweet spot is never easy.
I see. That's interesting. Cool. We have probably two or three more questions, Joao, then we'll wrap it up. One of it would be maybe an advice to the students out there, people who want to become like you. What does someone need to be successful in their career, or want to maybe pursue the same path that you did? Is it grit? Is it determination?
I would necessarily suggest to try to become like me, because there's definitely a lot of things that I would have done differently along the way if I could. But
for example, give us a few examples, Joao. What would you do differently?
I probably would have done, if I could, I would have done a year or two more of a Formula student, because I think it would have taught me a lot more of the practical things that I lacked in the beginning of my career, and it would have prepared me a lot better for the job that I had in F1. What else? I would have. One thing that I was about to say, you have to be a little bit stubborn. You have to kind of stick to your guns, and if you want to do that, then do everything you can to achieve it. Don't give up too easily. It can be very disheartening. I mean, when I was applying for jobs, I got rejected by the whole grid and the F2 grid and the F3 grid 5 times. I mean, the day I started at McLaren, I got an email from HRT, which was a team that didn't exist the following year, saying that they wouldn't give me an interview. And they were the worst team on the grid, and one of the best teams on the grid gave me a job, and they wouldn't even give me an interview. But this is very common and normal. So, don't get discouraged by this. Don't get, of course it's going to feel bad, but try to overcome that and try to stick to your plan and to what you want to achieve. And so you have to be a little bit stubborn to unless you get lucky and you get the first job you apply for, but I don't think that happens very often. But then obviously that stubbornness can bring you problems when you start, and that definitely happened for me. I was a little bit hot-headed and quite stubborn at the first years of my career, and so when you go in, try to learn as much as possible, try to absorb as much as possible, but understand that you know very little. Understand that as an engineer you're always going to know a lot less than what you'd like to know, but that you start knowing very, very little, and that you have a long way to go.
Was that one of the reasons you were kicked out and made that famous TikTok clip that went viral, or what was this about?
Nah, I think that came from a mistrust, because I at the time I was leaving to nothing. I was going traveling for a year and trying to figure out what to do next, maybe do a PhD. I didn't have a next step defined, and that's what I told them. But I think people at F1 can be a little bit suspicious, because obviously, if you say that and you stay in the office for the duration of your notice period, and then after 6 months you say, no, actually I'm going to Mercedes, then obviously you'll know everything that's happened in the car development until the last day, which obviously can put you at a great advantage. But that wasn't obviously the case, but at the same time, the people who quit at the same time weren't treated the same way. So maybe it was also because I was relatively new. I'd only been in the company for a couple of years, so I think that's kind of part of it. They didn't know me very well, whereas other people had been there for a bit longer. So there was a bit more confidence and trust established between them. So
yeah, interesting. What was your favorite project that you've worked on, and your least favorite project that you've worked on?
Okay, so as an aerodynamicist, favorite project was probably the Valkyrie, especially the second version. That never happened, but that one I was there from beginning to end. It was meant to be like a track-only version of the Valkyrie that was insanely fast, but it never. There is kind of a very fast car somewhere, but it never actually made it into production or anywhere close to it. Least favorite project as an aerodynamicist was probably there's two of them. There's the McLaren NP428 and the Red Bull RB13. There were two cars that were very poor at the start of the season. So the MP428, basically we had a good car the year before in 2012, and then it started the season as the fastest car. It finished the season as the fastest car. In the middle, we threw a lot of races away, like just for reliability problems. Also, we kind of maybe hit a bit of a lull in terms of development in the middle of the season. But generally speaking, we had a fast car. And so we only had to build on that and would have a fast car into 13, because the regulations stayed almost exactly the same. Instead, we decided to scrap it and start from this kind of that TV show of where there's these monsters made out of different cars. What is it?
I forgot the name. I know what you mean, but I forgot the name.
I can't remember what it is. But basically, this was it. So it had the front wing of a Ferrari, it had the nose of a Lotus, it had the side pods of this, it had the rear wing of that. It was a mess, and it was bad from the first day, and the whole season was spent trying to kind of polish it, but it was what it was, and it was a terrible, terrible race car. And we all knew it was going to be a terrible race car, because it first of all, the approach makes no sense to just copy 6 different cars, because these things all work within the context of their own flow field. They don't work individually, that's not how it works. And the majority of people in the team knew that. So yeah, that was pretty horrible. And then 13 was weird because it was it was the longest development cycle that I've ever been a part of. Like I think most of the team were on the car by I'm going to say May of the year before. So this car had a 10-month development cycle, which is insane. Like it was new rules. It was I understand it was a blank sheet of paper, but you had everyone on it, but they were approaching it as if it was the previous year's car. It was not being approached like a blank sheet of paper. It was being approached like the same. So you look at it at the launch car of RB13, and it looks like the previous year's car. And then Ferrari, Mercedes, and all those guys launched their cars, and they had these kind of, especially in front of the side pod, it looked like spaceships compared to ours. And it was extremely frustrating for me, especially because at some point in that off season, I did a piece of work where we had from the beginning we had a problem with that car, which was poor front right hand sensitivity that we knew was important, we knew was very damaging when that happened, and we did a lot of things to try to fix it, but we didn't really make much progress. And then I did a bit of work, I kind of sat back from the whole chaos and just said, okay, let's try and figure out why this is. And I compared the two cars in the wind tunnel in terms of kind of the pressure taps and like how that happened, how that progressed through the different parts of the aero map, and it became pretty clear that we were missing a big chunk of downforce there in the middle of the floor, and that's typically how you have good front right hand sensitivities. That when the front of the car comes up, your front wing gets unloaded, that loads the forward floor, and so it takes up some of the slack, and so it keeps things more or less constant. And I was pretty proud of that report because I thought I found something and something that we can hang on to and help us fixing the car. But yeah, the reaction from everyone was like, "Oh, cool," and it's deleted, it goes in the bin. And then a few months later, it became pretty obvious that there was definitely something there. So that was very frustrating as well. And I mean, I was already planning to leave at the end of at the beginning of the following season anyway, but that definitely validated my idea that I was done as an F1 aero for the time being.
Got it. Something people also wanted to know is, what does an F1 aerodynamicist or an aerodynamicist in general earn per year? Give us a range.
I mean, so when you start, I started at McLaren making £25,000 a year, which was the same salary as some colleagues of mine who started 7 years before me made. So inflation doesn't really get to these contracts very often. At Red Bull, I think the new guys were making 30, 35, something like that.
Really?
And then as in like as a junior, you make 30, 35,000 pounds a year. And then as you progress, then it depends on how well you negotiate and how good you are. But it's basically understanding when you are in a strong position and when you are not. I took, to start with, if they offered me 10, I would have taken 10 because I wanted to be an F1 aerodynamicist. I knew that I could go from there. You're not going to haggle about money when you're trying to get the job. But then from then on, you start having, something to stand on, and then you have to kind of see what you can. It's, for me, it's never been about the money. It's about what the money represents. The fact that you're being valued and that your worth is being reflected in your compensation. That's it. I know I'm very aware that I'm not going to become a millionaire by being an F1 engineer. I don't think, if that's what you want to do, if you want to drive a Porsche and all that, don't go into F1. Go to something else, because it's very few. There are very few people who get to that level.
That's a TikTok worthy clip. If you don't want to become a millionaire, don't become an F1 race engineer. That's a good one. Cool.
So I just realized I forgot to reply, and I'll reply quickly about what my favorite and least favorite projects were as a race engineer. Mm-hmm. I'd say my favorite was probably Le Mans. That was awesome. I think it's still kind of my spiritual home. I'd like to go back there one day and fight to win the whole thing. least favorite in terms of race engineering.
Was that when you worked for Jota? Is that correct, or am I wrong?
Yes. Yeah.
Jota, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
Cool.
My least favorite was probably that first job in LMP2 where I wasn't treated very nicely. I was fired twice in 4 races, so that was not ideal. But I take a lot of positives from that experience. That's the thing. I don't think I ever felt like I didn't take positives out of any of my racing engineering, performance engineering experiences. There were always good things about it. Whereas if you ask me if there are many good things about working on the development of MP428, not many. I mean, there were friendships and with my colleagues that are still going strong and all that. But in terms of the work, it was just a lot of pain. It was just a lot of pain. Because at one point, everything is so messed up that you're not even learning from anything because nothing works. You're stuck in a corner and nothing works. So you're not even learning about anything. It's just learning about what to do, which I guess can be valuable as well.
No, that's super insightful. I think people will definitely love the podcast episode, Joao. Where can people find you if they want to reach out to you?
Great question. LinkedIn.
It's difficult. You're not very active. You're not very active on LinkedIn or Instagram, right?
No, I'm not. I'm not very active on anything, to be honest. It's also about having time to be active. The season is pretty full on. I've got an Instagram where you can talk to me. It's one lap behind. I only post pictures there. I take pictures every now and then. So I think that's probably the easiest way. But if you bug me on LinkedIn, I'll reply. Maybe I won't reply the next day, but I'll reply eventually.
Sounds good, Joe. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was super, super insightful. And maybe we'll have a second part in the future. Who knows? But thank you so much for being on the show. And there's, I think, 2 more podcasts that you can find on YouTube. One on the engine braking podcast and another one you did with a younger guy. So make sure to check those out as well.
I would say it. Yeah. And we also had our own. I also had my own podcast here. It's in Portuguese, so it's called Domingos. There's 2 seasons worth of it if you want to go have a laugh. There's a couple of episodes in English that might be good fun to listen to. There's one of them with a guy called Blake Hinsey, who's from the Engine Braking podcast, so he came on the show in English, and it's a cool show. He's a nice guy to hear about F1 and kind of the more technical side of it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was good fun, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.
Sure. Take care, Joao.
Cheers.